Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Religion Unplugged podcast, your one-stop shop for all the best religious news and culture. I am your host, Joseph Holmes, and with us today is the great Megan Basham. She is a culture reporter for the Daily Wire and the author of Beside Every Successful Man, A Woman's Guide to Having It All. She is a frequent contributor to Morning Wire, one of the top news podcasts in the United States. She has also written for the Wall Street Journal, The Telegraph, First Things, National Review, and World Magazine, where she worked as a film and television editor. Her latest book, Shepherds for Sale, How Evangelical Leaders Traded the Truth for a Leftist Agenda, is on sale now. Mrs. Basham, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. I was very excited to have the opportunity to have you on. Obviously, I'm reviewing your new book for Religion Unplugged, and we'll get started. Your book has a very provocative title, obviously.
Yes.
So, the reason I really wanted to do this interview is because I actually believe the discussion that you're starting with your book is important for people who are interested in American Christianity, regardless of where they consider themselves politically on the American spectrum. But first, regardless, let's start with the basics. Would you describe the premise of your book and what inspired you to start working on it?
Well, I mean, I think like a lot of people, right around 2019, maybe even a little earlier in 2018, I started to notice narratives being promoted in the church that at best to me at that point were questionable. And I didn't understand where they were coming from. They were very ideologically left in nature, and they were being married to scripture in a way that suggested that Christians, in order to be faithful to the gospel, needed to do things like support climate change legislation or support, certain immigration bills. So to me, it was very much a way of manipulating scripture. And then I think, like a lot of people, in 2020, two events sort of broke open what was going on. And we all kind of went, okay, hang on a minute, something, is rotten in Denmark. And one was COVID. So we saw churches not just, make their own individual decisions about whether they would shut down or how much they would stay open or whether they would, sing or any of those things. But it became this cudgel that was being wielded against all of American evangelicalism, you might say. So we saw things like love your neighbor, get the shot. So something that should have been a personal medical decision became, no, you have a biblical obligation to get this vaccine. Or we saw all of these organizations promoting Francis Collins in ways that were, I would say, ethically extremely dubious. And then the second thing that happened that year was the George Floyd riots. So as we saw that happening, you saw leaders who were just telling us, stay home, you have to get vaccinated, those sort of things. Then we're suddenly okay with these BLM marches. Some leaders even took part in them. Some suggested that it was a gospel issue to support, if not the specific organization BLM, but you had to support the BLM mantra. And so when all of that was going on, I think like a lot of people, my Christian workplace, my Christian school, my Christian church, obviously, all became a bit of a battleground over these issues. And I just went, what's going on? So I was experiencing it personally, and that's what set me off on this subject, because right around then, I also providentially went to work for the Daily Wire. So suddenly I was working for a secular conservative outlet. And I think somehow suddenly being professionally outside of the club in a way gave me the freedom to write about it in a way that was a little tougher when I was inside the club. So that's really how it started.
Yes. So what would you then say? So the premise of your book is called Shepherds for Sales. Like, what was the thing that you kind of, as you started digging into, okay, there seems to be a big shift in evangelicalism that you're noticing, that's, hey, in order to be a faithful Christian, you have to support these very specific left-leaning causes. And you hadn't really noticed that before, but that was something that you were suddenly noticing. So as you were digging, what was it that you found that you were kind of discovering that became sort of the thrust of your book?
Well, I mean, I can tell you that the first sort of big initial story that put me on the map when I was reporting on this was the COVID issue and Francis Collins in particular. Um, this didn't require deep investigative work. In a sense, all of this material, like breadcrumbs, was just sort of out there. And I heard myself, Francis Collins, on a number of interviews with Christianity Today, with Ed Stetzer at the Billy Graham Center at Wheaton, with Rick Warren, with Tim Keller, with N.T. Wright. I mean, everywhere. I just kept hearing these interviews with, if you're not familiar, National Institutes of Health former director Francis Collins, also known as Anthony Fauci's boss. And as I started digging, I went, there was a lot of really troubling things about Francis Collins and how he was being presented as a responsible Christian voice and a trustworthy Christian voice. And when you knew his record, you knew that was extremely debatable. He has argued for continuing to make fetal stem cells available. He has defended research into using aborted baby parts. He himself has declared himself an LGBTQ ally and launched initiatives under his watch and, under his initiative, these LGBT research programs that included transgender mastectomies on girls as young. I need to check my notes, but I think it was 8 or 12. I can't quite remember right now, but it was young girls. And so all of these things that were very troubling about Francis Collins, and none of that was being mentioned as he was being paraded around as one of us. He's one of us. He's an evangelical. We can trust him. You should do what he says because he's a faithful Christian man. And so I had some really big issues with that. And that was probably the first thing I wrote about that went viral and got a lot of attention.
Yeah. So I think it's really interesting because there's, and a lot of your book really is about showing how a lot of the, let's say the elite, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way, evangelical leaders and institutions, even though there is this, idea that evangelicals tend to be more right-wing than the rest of the country, that they often are politically left in a lot of or at the very least, they have both sort of politically right and politically left things that they claim that they believe in, but they tend to more advocate for the politically left ones. And you talk about that a lot in your book. And it's really interesting because there's practically a cottage industry around the book publishing world about how the political right has co-opted American Christianity.
Right.
And here's the thing: typically they won't say this is bad because being a conservative is bad. But what they will say is this is bad because mixing politics with faith is bad. That's typically sort of the argument. Yet, as you show in your book, first of all, there's an entire progressive political organizations, many of them secular, whose own stated goals are to flip evangelical Christians to vote for progressive causes. Right. Many of them, directly partnering with mainstream evangelical organizations. And it's also long been known, and you show this in your book as well, that the religious left has always been more political than the religious right, whether you agree with their politics or not. Sociologist George Yancey talks about that in his book, One Faith No More, that not only is the religious left statistically more likely to engage in political activism than the religious right, but they're also more likely to use politics rather than theology as a test for political orthodoxy. So conservative Christians are more likely to say you're not a faithful Christian if you don't believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus, whereas progressive or mainline Christians are more likely to say you're not a faithful Christian if you don't believe in a carbon tax on climate change, open borders, take the vaccine, whatever. So, but surprisingly, a lot of evangelicals, particularly at the top of evangelical organizations, either push many of those same things. You talk about that in your book, or are just more likely to talk about those issues sort of on the political left than the right. So, talk about some of those stuff that you found kind of as you were writing the book.
Right. So after I sort of launched off with the Francis Collins things and started talking to people and meeting people and digging into some of the funding for some of these organizations that have specifically evangelical names, like you said, like the Evangelical Immigration Table or the Evangelical Environmental Network, the Evangelical Climate Initiative. So when you dug into those, it became very clear very quickly that they were taking funding from secular left foundations. And, I spend a lot of time detailing it with footnotes because you sort of fear that people are going to go, oh, that's tinfoil hat stuff. And you go, no, it's not. It's really happening that George Soros has given money to foundations that, that funding is then being funneled into evangelical organizations. And in his own documents for his foundation, Open Society, they say our intention is to, they wouldn't use the word co-opt, but is to co-opt evangelical voters for these initiatives because we have come to realize that we are not going to be able to enact our policy preferences without the buy-in of religious Americans. So, I mean, they transparently write that this is going to have to be a goal of ours. So what I started doing at that point was tracking money trails and finding that so often, whether it was Soros or a man named Pierre Omidyar, who is the left-wing Buddhist founder of eBay, he has a foundation called the Democracy Fund, Rockefeller Foundation, Hewlett Foundation, which is the second largest funder of Planned Parenthood. You had all of these very hard left foundations funneling money into evangelical organizations, what I would call front groups. And I think it's really important to know that, these foundations, the other things that they support, that they tie to a healthy democracy are very hard left things, like the Democracy Fund's heavy support of abortion, or the Rockefeller Foundation's efforts to ensure that, quote unquote, youth, meaning children, get gender affirming care and what they would call reproductive justice. So when you see those kind of groups funneling money, not just into these, what I would call evangelical front groups, but also well-established organizations that we all know and respect, like the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, which is the lobbying arm of the Southern Baptist Convention, or Trinity Forum, which was founded by Os Guinness in the early 90s. I mean, these are organizations that we know and that we respect. And I'm saying these organizations are now being co-opted for left-wing purposes.
Yeah. So, and then again, this goes back to the kind of we're saying at the beginning, where again, if you're sort of somebody who's on the political left or the religious left, you might say, well, again, I don't have a problem with evangelicals being, kind of moved in that direction. And, fair enough. The issue, though, of course, is that, many people don't know that that's actually, going on, or that the, funding is coming from these places, or there is that partnership, that sort of political partnership that's going on.
It's subterfuge.
Well, so I mean, on the flip side of that, one of the things that I didn't find myself most persuaded by in your book was the argument of causation. Mm-hmm. That the progressive activist organizations pumping money into or evangelical institutions is the reason for that leftward drift in evangelical kind of circles. While you show conclusively that there is, these organizations that they're doing this and they're doing, that they're trying to do this and do this on purpose, I didn't see a lot of places that show the one-to-one that the activist organizations are the primary driver of the leftward shift. In fact, a lot of the places where you do talk about, like the Trinity Forum and then, the Embrace Journey, I believe it's what it's called. These places already were looking to have a more progressive outlook and way of doing things. And then they sought out, organizations that could fund them, that were more interested in their, sharing the values that they already kind of had. And, it's kind of like, again, Christian organizations saying like, okay, I'm going to start seeking out funding or taking money from like a secular pro-life group because I already have those values. I'm looking for places to support them. Now, where would you push back on that you do see more causation in the, in these organizations funneling money and the change in evangelical attitudes, at least in the elite's institutional level?
Well, one, I mean, I don't think causation is as simple typically in real life as a man with a twirling mustache showing up, in the dead of night and going, here's an envelope of cash. You now, completely sell out your organization. I think that it's an evolution. And so what we see is that people who, let's take Christianity Today and its editor-in-chief, Russell Moore, who I think a lot of people can say has, had an interesting trajectory. He's already kind of started to shift on things like, say, women in the pastorate and things like that in surprising ways where he used to be very firm. So part of what I would say is that, one, I don't think it was always intention. I don't think it was always self-consciously transactional, but that doesn't mean you're not for sale. So if you are sort of evolving in that direction, because it's not just, hey, we're getting this funding, but it's also we're being invited to these very Tony elite organizations. We're being recognized as people of influence in these very I think elite is the right word when you're talking about global billionaires. So, we're being brought to Davos for the World Economic Forum meeting. I think those things are very likely to turn anyone's head. And so I try very hard not to read motivations into people's hearts in this book, because that's not my job. I'm not God. I can't say, here's definitely why they did it, but I can show you this money came in, this influence came in, and then we started to see a shift in some of these organizations. Now, as to your question about did they, in some cases, become this first and then go out and look for the funding? Yeah, that did happen. For example, I write a little bit about this new initiative from Duke Divinity professor Curtis Chang and New York Times columnist David French, Christianity Today editor-in-chief Russell Moore. They have this new sort of initiative that is supposed to go into churches. It's a curriculum to teach them how to be less divisive about their politics and how to approach politics in a biblical way. And they very openly said, we were not able to get funding on this from Christians, so we went to they wouldn't say hard secular left foundations, but they were. So they say we approached those hard secular left foundations. So both things are happening. One, there is now an awareness we can get money and funding from these people, but there is also, I think, what you might call just the atmosphere of influence of really powerful people. And in that case, without reading into people's hearts, I would say it's very understandable to go, there's a self-rationalization. So, I don't know that there's a sit down and go, I am shifting my position on something like climate change, or I'm adopting that because they're handing me a check. But I do think there is just an atmosphere of this is the respectable position to have. And then the money is offered. And then you're approached by organizations who say, we would like to come in and give presentations and things of that nature. And it's very flattering to be acknowledged by people of that stature. And so I do think that's what we're seeing. So, my argument would be, I can't tell you absolutely in everyone's heart why they did it, but I can show you that it's happening.
Sure. So, you do show your argument sort of is, look, we have a timeline where, they start taking money from this organization, and then later on you start seeing this drift. So you can't necessarily prove causation, but you can prove timeline, and it is a reasonable causation to make. In many instances, not in all instances, sometimes it happens the other way around, but in terms of timeline. But there is a timeline, there's a timeline there that is reasonable in terms of saying causation is a part of it.
Right. And in terms of that, what I can show that is explicitly stated is the motivation of the left-wing foundations who openly say, we are going to try to make inroads with, for example, the Southern Baptist Convention and other evangelical groups. So, while I don't have a smoking gun letter from, say, Rick Warren saying, I'm going to sell out for the left, I don't have that. But what I do have are these left-wing secular foundations saying, we realize that we have a problem in evangelical Christians, that they are creating a roadblock to our policy efforts. So we have to find a way to bring them on board. So we certainly know that that was their intention, and that they didn't say, hey, these Christians came to us and we were surprised, but let's partner with them. It was very clear that they said, we are going to find a way into these organizations, and actually wrote that in some of their reports.
Yeah. And again, it's one of those things where, this is a thing that, in the majority of when people are talking about this issue, they don't talk about this thing as something that's happening. They talk about it as something that, again, like I forget the guy's name, but, one of the guys in the God and Country documentary, which I reviewed, he was like, hey, like I have, politicians, people on the right saying, hey, you need to talk on the abortion thing harder so that we can gin up votes. Like he's saying that that's
right.
And so that's the narrative, is that that's happening on the right, but nobody talks about the fact that it is also happening on the left. And the argument is, hey, we don't like the stuff happening on the right because it's politics, not because, well, we happen to disagree with that politics. So again, that's worth, again, that's a thing that your book is doing as well, is talking about the thing that this is a thing that's happening. Again, I've been in churches in New York, for a long time, and I've gone to Redeemer, I've gone to many of these places, and one of the things that I found is that many of these places, and like Tim Keller says this, and I very much like Tim Keller, but one of the things he's talked about is the fact that, like in his view, a Christian, to be like a person with a faithful Christian worldview would sort of be considered right wing on issues of life and sexuality, and would be sort of considered left-wing on issues of economic and racial justice. Although there's a place, I can't find it now, where he kind of said he wasn't sure that the government should be the person doing the economic thing, but I can't find that anymore, so I can't prove that, but that's a whole other thing. But the thing is that, that's his stated idea of what a biblical worldview is. Agree with it or disagree with it. That's what he says, a biblical worldview would look like. And yet, I would, go to, Redeemer, and I would go to many other churches in the city, and I would see them, talk about the parts that they believe were biblical, on racial and economic justice, but like, at a rate of 10-1, not talk about the things that they claim that they believed in also equally passionately about, life or sexuality. And that was kind of, I was like, well, okay, like if this is what you say you believe, like either talk about both of them or don't talk about any of them. Like, right. It's like you're only talking about the ones that are gonna get you points in the city that you're in, and you're not talking about the other ones. And this is a thing you talk about really well, I think, is another point, with like something like the Gospel Coalition, which is again considered to be part of the reason it has such a pull within evangelical circles, is because it is seen to be reflective of the base. Right. And yet you show, like, look, they've done all of these articles on climate change, which, and cool, fair enough, why not? But then they haven't done ones on transgenderism. And when they have, it's not been, like a strong opinion for it. And so it's like, okay, well, at that point, are you really reflecting your base and what it cares about? Right. At all in that regard.
Well, and also the fact that, I would point out too, that I do take pains to go, look, I think it's fine as Christians to have disagreements on, to what degree is humankind impacting the climate and the temperature. I don't actually know. My husband's a meteorologist, so I'm very skeptical of that, but I'm also like, I'm not omniscient. I don't know. So perhaps I could be wrong about that. And I think that's an open issue that we can debate about as Christians. I would never say, okay, well, I now doubt your faith because you think climate change is a serious issue that, we need to address in policy. But I do not think that it is an issue that Scripture speaks very clearly on and that we can't disagree. If you think, no, I think this is natural, mostly natural fluctuation in temperature, I think that's a perfectly reasonable Christian position to have as well. And same thing goes on immigration. I think we can have debates on, what is the wisest and most humane immigration policy. So my objection was how those issues were being leveraged to suggest there is no debate and the same goes for racial justice, that I went, okay, look, I think there's a lot of room for debate here about what's causing some of the disparities that we see in the US and what the response to that should be. And it was like several steps were skipped. And instead of having that argument, it was assumed that this is the Christian response by so many of these elite individuals and publications. And that hammer was just brought down about this is how the church needs to respond. And they basically skipped the debate, is how I felt.